Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Nikos Zacharis of the Southeast European Research Center, and on behalf of everybody in the TeRRItoria project, I would like to thank our speakers and our panelists and all of you for being here. This is the third part of our final event that is being done online, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. And our final event is titled Responsible Research and Innovation Institutional Changes for Improved Regional Governance. And this the third part today is titled The Way Forward. And we're going to discuss what will regional strategies will look like in the near future and even beyond after 2027. How will these regional strategies be developed to respond on the double challenge of climate change and digital transformation? How can we design more effective multi-level governance policies, and how responsible research and innovation can facilitate these required transformations? I'm going to show you, I'm trying to share now, but I don't know why I cannot move my slides. Okay, you see that now? Okay, some housekeeping rules before we start. So please ensure that you have your microphones switched off when you enter. You can use the chat to send questions and comments even from the beginning, and we'll try to gather them and read all of them and answer all of them as possible. If time allows, we will give the opportunity to participants to take the floor and comment or question orally. I will do that if we have time, and I will tell you to raise hand, to use the raise hand function of Zoom in order to give you the floor. When asking a question, please go straight forward to the point and ensure so that we can ensure that interaction between the speaker and other participants is ample. And as you probably have noticed already, this dialogue and this webinar is being recorded. This is the agenda. Very, very briefly, we have two keynote speeches from Dr. Michele Ladabasso and Dr. Dimitris Potikakis from the ECJRC, and from Professor Philip McCann from the University of Sheffield. There will be questions and answers briefly after each one of the speeches. Then two panelist interventions from Dr. Ingeborg May, Leiden University, and from Dr. Nguyen Nguyen from Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And then a final discussion, questions and answers to all of them, and a final discussion among the participants. And me and Dr. Ippo Ipoli will close the event. So I'm stop sharing now, and I would like to introduce our first two speakers and give the floor to them. So Michele Ladabasso, who works at the European Commission since 1990, he's Director of Growth and Innovation at the Joint Research Center, managing the Sevilla site. He was previously Director of Strategy and Corporate Communication at DG Com, and also worked as Head of Cabinet of Regional Policy Commissioner and Head of Unit in several units, including the Smart and Sustainable Growth Unit. And Dimitris Potikakis is an economist and a Knowledge for Finance, Innovation and Growth Unit, part of the Smart Specialisation for Sustainability team, and contributing to the JRC activities and innovation. So the floor is yours, and Jacob, you can share the presentation. Thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikos. We are honored and we are very grateful because this is a very timely conference for us. We are honored because what you're going to see is a preview of what we are working at, which is this transition between the smart specialization strategies and into smart specialization strategies for sustainability, with governance, improved governance at the heart of it all. And it is timely because this is a preview. It's the first time that we are going to talk on behalf of all the colleagues you see there. Dimitri, who is going to speak after me, talking about the what. I'm going to talk about the how and the why. Xavier and Joan are in the audience, and they will be ready to respond to your very difficult questions. We are honored and grateful also because we believe this is the right setting for presenting this preview. I've always thought that URADA members, and I know that there are URADA members, academics, and friends of Smart Specialization here in the audience. This is the type of, intermediation between the academia and the reality, between science and pragmatism, between, the URADA members have always been the people in the front line that have to convince the politicians, get dirty with the investments, take risks, make mistakes, learn, and continue, moving ahead from the ground in contact with the key stakeholders, but with the head in the best academia possible, trying to translate these ideas and these methodologies that we propose into realities to change the situation, to transform. And the word transformation and change through innovation in the direction of the Green Deal is what we will be talking about today. Now, so let's start. I will deal with the why and the how, and then Dimitri will continue on the real interesting part, which is the what. So please, the next slide. So what we are looking at here is that we had a methodology, the RIS3 methodology, Smart Specialization Strategies methodology, that has been there for nearly a decade, and we need to review it in line with a number of issues. One is that the world has moved forward, and I will touch upon some characteristics of what we understand, in what ways this moving forward, this change in the world, in the framework conditions, influences the methodology. Another one is precisely this decade. We need to incorporate in the new version what we call a playbook for policymakers on S4, the lessons that we have learned throughout this decade. And we are missing a little bit quantitative evaluations of the impact of the RIS3, not focusing on the RIS3 as an objective in itself, but as a means to an end, which is productivity, new jobs, and economic development, in particular in those places that need it most. So the why I will touch in a minute, the how is here in this slide. We are going to use a scientific committee, and I'm proud and happy to confirm that Phil, who will be giving the next speech, is part of it. With some of the best economists that have been working in this field for years, in order to be sure that the refreshment, the new version of this methodology that Dimitri will tell you about in a minute, draws and distills the best academia today available, the best thinking of these people. But our objective, let's be clear about this, is to co-write through a pilot action this methodology, this playbook, on the basis of the practical experimentation of the new ideas, marginally new ideas, that practitioners on the ground will learn. So the idea is something that we did already some years ago, to co-write this methodology, this RIS methodology, this RIS plus, RIS3 methodology, together with the real people on the ground. So lessons learned, and my colleagues in the GRC here in Seville have produced a number of very useful policy reports on this that we will incorporate in the new methodology. The quantitative efforts that my colleagues, in particular Xavier's team, is doing now in quantitative evaluations, and by that also identifying the right indicators to measure progress in the RIS3, is another line of research that we are developing. In that sense, I have to say that the intervention logic report by Christian Soblenz, that you know very well, is a very important document that we will be using to refresh this methodology. These indicators, and I'll refer to that in a minute with a slide. Then, of course, the work that we are doing also with the UN and other agencies in, using RIS3 in the direction of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the recent publications on that will be another source of inspiration for this renewal. And last but not least, we want to draw much more widely, for reasons that I will explain in a minute, from the knowledge and the research of colleagues, in particular, colleagues that are working on the Green Deal and the digital transformation in our directorate in Seville, but not only, to incorporate that in the RIS4 methodology. The RIS4, the S4 methodology has as its DNA, the entrepreneurial process of discovery, but probably with different emphasis depending on the stakeholders that are touched for this, let's say, itinerary, travel direction into the Green Deal, which is all the stakeholders that are not only entrepreneurs themselves, but others that relate to changes in consumption as well as production, changes in attitudes, behaviors of people that are needed in order to reach the objective of the Green Deal. And we will enrich this process of entrepreneurial discovery process by using hard tools that will frame a debate with the private sector, in particular with indicators and evidence that sometimes is being absent from these discussions and has led to maybe relaying too much on qualitative inputs and maybe traditional usual suspects that need to be more diverse if we really go in the direction of the Green Deal. Let's continue, please. This is how we are going to work on this. I said the world has moved on, and this is one of the reasons we are, improving or getting the RIS3 methodology to the next stage. To start with, there is an increased directionality. So the alignment to the new political priorities of the European Commission, and in particular, the Green Deal as the S4 strategy for the whole Union should be an inspiration in order to be much more precise about where we exercise, for example, the entrepreneurial discovery process, actions, discussions, even going into this notion of missions, which means establishing objectives for a number of key stakeholders and then re-engineer back into what type of steps in the form of programs, in the form of actions, not only the investment actions, but regulatory ones that are needed to reach those objectives. The second reason why we need this S4 is that we are not only dealing with cohesion funds as an enabling condition, as it is the case for RIS3, and we do not want to create any confusion or any competition amongst these two methodologies. Let's be clear about this. The pilot that we will be running after May probably will be hand in hand with DG Regio and our commissioner responsible for Horizon Europe. So it's a question of avoiding fragmentation. It's a question of maximizing synergies between the structural funds, cohesion fund, and the recovery and resilience plans. This is something that it is very important for us. One wonders why for the recovery and resilience plans, national plans, national authorities, regional authorities have not drawn much more inspiration and ideas from the well-established public-private partnerships, that were created for the RIS3 in order to feed the investment streams of the cohesion funds. These people have been working strategically on the ground, and they are supposed to be a good source of ideas for feeding these plans. So fragmentation is a question we want to address. Then the world has moved on because there are other sources of innovation. And the issue about innovation procurement, the demand, not only the supply side, social innovation that we started some time ago, but it becomes so very important now after COVID and in this resilience paradigm, which is new, which is my next point, by the way. The resilience means that it is not enough to maximize, let's say, benefit and diminish costs, but there is a question of resilience, the capacity to, face adversity and recover and bounce forward in the right direction, the twin transition in this case. Then we believe the Green Deal requires a whole of government approach, intelligent subsidiarity, working across horizontally in the government and vertically in a given territory. And as I said before, it's not only a question of investment, it's a question of behaviors, regulations, innovation procurement, and then considerations that go well beyond GDP. It's not only about increasing productivity or innovation for its own sake. It's about meeting societal needs. It's about the new notions like Bauhaus and sustainable development goals. Let's continue, please, very quickly, because otherwise Dimitri won't have much time. This is a very nice graph that synthesizes, thanks to Christian and colleagues, the S3 rationale from the theory to the expected outcomes, and has the advantage of being able to characterize this. But most importantly, to think of RIS3, and in this situation now S4, as a means to an end. I find that in many instances our evaluations have been focusing on the methodology, the S3 methodology as such. And we have very little evidence, and we need to put a lot more effort into that, into the real objective, which is economic development, without leaving no one behind. So we were focusing on, as I said the other day, on the finger that points to the moon instead of the moon. Okay, and this has to be very clear in our mind. This is why the S3 expected outcomes in this list is so important. Let's continue, please, very quickly. What are the problems with what are the lessons that we want to draw from in order to review the methodology? Well, we find an insufficient degree of granularity in the selection of priorities in many regions still. This is to say that there was a low-level consensus, tick the box, get the money, and move on. It doesn't undermine in any way the notion that in most regions, as some of the early evaluations are making explicit, RIS3 has improved the governance system of innovation. And system is a word that we particularly like, because we look at innovation as a system. It's not new, but it is very important to be reminded. Secondly, you cannot invite the private sector to give the best ideas and say, thank you very much, we'll see you in a few months, and keep them in a corner, or not informed about what is going on. So we need another way of interacting with the private sector and other relevant stakeholders for the Green Deal. And this has to be reflected in the new methodology. The fragmentation of effort I've touched upon, it cannot be that people move through this maze of acronyms when many of them really aim at the same project and use innovation as the vehicle. This kind of territorial silly competition or silos or egos brings us nowhere. Then there is the lack of directionality. I mean, what are you trying to achieve? What is the end result that you can translate and communicate to the citizens with your RIS3? The new sources of innovation, a much broader toolbox that we were considering in some instances in some regions in RIS3, and then very, very important, the pan-European approach. I mean, our colleagues in GROW are talking about industrial ecosystems, value chains, and they are international by nature in most cases. How do people link in? How the regions can collaborate? Is there a mechanism that can fund these efforts? And I think that we are in contact with Regio, and we have high hopes in Interreg I3. Let's continue very quickly now. Please, the following one. There are a number of lessons along the way that build on what I just said, but I will leave you to read that carefully or calmly later on, because I want to leave this space for Dimitri. Let's continue, please. I want to show you just some examples of this fragmentation. We need batteries, we need many other things, but do we need so many initiatives from different parts of the union on the same topic, or do we need to connect it somehow? Let's continue, please. What about fragmentation of effort on our own side, in the Commission side, vertically and horizontally? You know, these are all funding lines that, you know, maybe we need to reflect more carefully about synergies and cooperation, which is a standing issue for all of us. S4 can be the beginning of the response to that. If we combine synergetically some of this funding, making sense of it all under the same strategic objectives and with the same playbook, I think there will be clearly some possibilities of making our policies more impactful. Let's continue, please. The new old problems, the innovation divide is there. Let's continue, please. What does it mean in practical terms? Well, there is a worrying situation that deals with the automation in particular and the advent of artificial intelligence. We had one of the biggest and, in my opinion, best international conferences this year here in Seville on the impact of automation on jobs, with a multidisciplinary approach perspective on it. But you see these shared of middle skilled people going down, and the one that is stable and declining, the green one. What does it mean in terms of, for example, populism? Let's continue. What does it mean also? And I'm now quoting here this McKinsey report that is saying that 48 cities by 2030 will accumulate half of the new good jobs in Europe. What does it mean for our territories, for the majority, for example, of regions in France, in Spain, in Italy, but not only, of course, that will see their good job opportunities shrinking while the others are booming through the roof? Or what does it mean, this advent of AI, among others, on the automation of our jobs? Who is going to take care of these transitions in skills, in tasks? And what does it mean for the previous lines I show you in green and blue? Let's continue, and I promise to shut up in 2 minutes. The quality of governance, this map is very telling. And the following one, let's continue, please. The correlation, the direct correlation of the regulatory quality by government and innovation. Because if innovation is the recipe to come out of the crisis, if innovation is the recipe to become more resilient, and regulation has a direct correlation, and there is a link to governance, to institutional thickness, then S4 has to continue improving this situation. Let's continue, please, and I'm going to pass it on to Dimitri. I think, yeah, Dimitri, please.
Yes, thank you, Mikel. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. S4, why do we need S4 and why do we need it now? Mikel made some very important points about where we're coming from and the reasoning. Let me complement that a little bit with the important transformation implied by the European Green Deal, which is an occasion to infuse it with innovation, to make sure that we don't just change our production systems to make them more sustainable, but it become also, this transformation becomes an occasion to produce better societal outcomes, higher quality jobs, a fairer society, and importantly, secure Europe's position in the economy of the future. Now is a good time to begin this reflection because we have a confluence of maturing trends that have been going on for a little while. The world is moving on. There are deep global transformations in many human support systems, in housing, food, but also energy, transport, and digitalization. Just like when you renovate your house, it's an occasion to change many things, to repurpose old rooms to new functions. It is also an occasion to retool our economies and to improve societal outcomes that relate to sustainability, the quality of air, health outcomes. And all of these are massive opportunities that are waiting to be reaped. And we can only reap them through innovation, through system-level innovation, as Mikkel said. And at the same time, we are living in a time where policymakers are more willing to experiment with industrial policy again. And the EU indeed sees its future competitiveness as going through sustainability. I remind you that the European Green Deal is not just a climate policy, it is an industrial policy as well as a social policy. And very importantly, the combination of the three make it an innovation policy because it implies system-level transformations. And this brings us to another maturing trend, a new scientific paradigm, a new way of thinking about innovation and acting under this understanding, the so-called transformative innovation policy, which argues that a lot of the economic value from innovation comes from complementary changes in the overall framework system, including in regulations, in the conditions for demand, and of course in the consumption system. And this will be a very large focus of our effort at co-creating the S4 methodology with the regions in the pilot that Mikkel mentioned. And of course, the JSC has a long experience in co-developing smart specialization with the member states and the regions, and more recently, pertinent experience in coordinating across policy domains and breaking silos with the JSC task force on the recovery and resilience plans. Next slide, please. So, what are we trying to achieve with S4? We see S4 as having four primary objectives. Through innovation, deliver effective solutions to pressing societal challenges. And very importantly, we need to do this within defined timeframes. And this is very important. Unlike the previous programming period and the previous generations of all sorts of innovation strategies, where we had the endless frontier, we sought to make the world better through science and technology. Now, in addition to doing this remains to be important, we also have to bring practical solutions to bear on the problems of deploying solutions to the environmental challenges and to the new energy system, and trying new solutions in all territories to make sure that all territories have a place. We need in the priorities that S4, this new generation of strategies are conceiving, they need to take into account multiple value creation, this idea of not just having one priority which aims at competitiveness and another priority that aims at sustainability, but having them joined, make them one thing. And at the same time, making sure that, that this combined effort creates actions that generate jobs, that generate more opportunities for disadvantaged groups, and ensure that unheard voices are given a say at how our future production and consumption systems will look like. In order to do that, this new generation of innovation policy needs to draw linkages across multiple policy domains and exploit synergies. Now, these are difficult tasks. We all know how difficult it is to coordinate across policy silos. If it were easy, we would be already doing it. So this will inevitably give rise to tensions, and we need practical ways of doing this. I will allude to one practical way of doing this that can focus efforts. But there could be many more, and we need to co-discover these also in the pilot with the regions. Last but not least, we need to reform, revise, and retool government in general to facilitate this whole of government approach that the European Commission is promoting for the Sustainable Development Goals and for the European Green Deal, and make sure that we reap the synergies and we amplify the impact of these policies. And before we go to the next slide, let me just say a few words about how S4 builds on the successes of S3, of the positive experiences that many of you as policymakers have had, and focuses them on action with transformative potential. We believe at this point in time, as part of a small JSE team that develops this initial guidance for the pilot, we believe that there are several elements in smart specialization strategies that have strong transformative potential. The broad stakeholder engagement and mobilization brought forward by the entrepreneurial discovery process is a huge asset, which we should build on and extend upon. We also need to use the EDP as an occasion to promote multi-level governance and to link actions from the national level to territorial problems. And this is difficult. We need to find practical ways of doing this. And we also need to identify synergies between policies and between funds to promote broad-based innovation for SMEs, the social dimension of innovation, and like I said earlier, directions for innovation that lead to co-benefits for the economy, society, and the environment. Now, in addition to all these promising paths and this baseline that is already in place because of the successful experience with S3, S4 can also seek to introduce additional elements, additional processes of change, such as challenge-oriented innovation, perhaps local missions, to coordinate actions focused very much on a territorial problem under a single directional logic, and bring to bear the efforts of many stakeholders and many levels of governance. To explore policy mixes for system-level innovation that include interventions from outside the traditional confines of innovation policy, including national line ministries in employment, social and fiscal policy, as well as energy, health, transport, waste. And of course, as many of you are already perhaps experimenting with, promote innovation through regulation, such as through regulatory sandboxes, and through demand-side policies, through the possible creation of lead markets, using the occasion of transformative investments in the energy transport systems to create innovation spaces for experimentation and for the rollout and scale-up and deployment of innovative solutions that have been developed in the region, and give regional firms an important testing ground, as well as promoting actions to improve the affordability of the solutions, to make them more accessible to citizens, which will be a very important part of S4. So, next slide, please. So how do you do it? And this slide is really at the heart of what we think will be central to doing it. A renewed and repurposed entrepreneurial discovery process that, in addition to working forwards from the rationale for changing, from the region's strengths, from the region's opportunities, also works backwards from the transformative outcomes that the region wants to see for its future. So what does working backwards mean? It means that you begin with the societal challenges. You conceptualize a positive outcome, what one would call a solved challenge. And what would it look for a territory? The stakeholders will have an important say in this. It may be that the very important challenge for the territory is to make sure that there are no new disadvantaged groups as the energy transition happens, for example. If you want to do that, you have to work backwards with all implicated stakeholders, including workers, trade unions, in addition to the knowledge system, And of course, the companies themselves that will produce these jobs, that will have to deploy the productive investments. And you have to change many things. You have to experiment with regulation. You have to use demand-side tools, and you have to group with different parts of government to do that under a single directional logic. This is what perhaps a local ecosystem-based mission might look like, that can be orchestrated and initiated through the ADP, through this important engine of smart specialization. Next slide, please. And to conclude, you and everyone who is involved in this collective effort will need tools to navigate this transition of our production systems, but also in part also our policy systems towards sustainable development, and development that is holistic, that creates both economic opportunities and also addresses important societal challenges such as sustainability. We will make the most honest attempt possible to create a playbook, a document that documents some of the leading thinking and practice on innovation, working closely with key experts, but also taking important advice from practitioners about what works and what could work better, to come up with a set of tools, a set of concepts, but also approaches, diagnostic tools, and guiding principles, as well as good practices and examples from the ground, from many regions that are already introducing many of these elements in their strategies and in their policy making, to guide the pilot, to guide the testing of some of these novelties and their fuller rollout in the pilot regions and member states, and to facilitate exploration, experimentation, and learning. This playbook, as the name implies, is not a linear guide, is not a handbook with a recipe that you follow to the letter, and by the end of it, you come up with a successful S4. It is very much a set of Lego building blocks that you can use to develop a strategy that is in keeping with this new direction of the European Green Deal. It will be pluralistic, and it will provide guidance without being prescriptive about which steps you need to follow. Which steps you need to follow will very much depend on the diagnosis of the system and of the challenges that you are facing in your territory. And that's why Mikkel places so much emphasis on diagnosis, on evidence, on tools. And we need to have, we need to bring many more of these to bear. We will have a first edition of the playbook ready by mid-May this year. And we also hope to have an online version of it that will allow us to develop it over time, to improve it, and to change it, of course, on the face of the experience in the ground, in the pilot, and come up with a more fully fledged methodology that offers support to those policymakers that want to follow this path. At this point, I'm concluding. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. And I give the floor back to Mikkel in case he wants to conclude.
Well, thank you, Dimitri. But I think we've covered our space. So maybe Phil, Nikos,
Yes.
in your hands.
Thank you very much, both of you, Dimitris, Mikhail, in the extremely interesting presentation. Very many things to think about. I'm really very excited to hear that one of the targets is not to leave anybody behind, the inclusiveness, to not have new disadvantaged groups and so on. All this is very relevant to our discussion and our concept of anticipation and reflectiveness that underpins responsible research and innovation. So this is very, very good. As I said, we will have some questions. So if there is any question, I don't see anything in the chat, but if anybody wants to ask something, please raise your hand so I can give you the floor. Or if you want to think about it, let me ask a question myself then, and until we have somebody else. So my question to both of you is, EDP has been a very successful tool up till now. How do you see this to include more citizens and society? I mean, it's a dialogue between regional authorities and businesses effectively. So how can we put the citizens inside this?
I think Dimitri has this notion of open EDP that he can now explain to you.
I think that's a very pertinent question. I think it's very the EDP is a wonderful setting to have these discussions, but for some reason these discussions do not happen. And I think one of the problems is that we need to refocus our thinking on what the challenges are in the region that would interest citizens too. Citizens, of course, want jobs, and many of them are also entrepreneurs, but not all of them care only about jobs and about entrepreneurship. So what are the everyday problems that we can bring into this discussion? What are the real challenges? We did this industrial transition review of Andalusia, for example, and one of the things we heard from stakeholders, in fact, one of them was from the regional government, but she was speaking to her in the capacity as a private citizen. She told us, I don't want my children to leave. That's an important societal challenge. I want them to find high quality jobs here. How do we do that? And that's a different challenge. That's a very different challenge. Another one might have to do with improving the quality of life in cities. And cities can have an important role there because they combine many of the policy perspectives. We will also have to, to do that, I think this working backwards from the challenges idea, which is by no means ours. There's a lot of thinking and practical development on so-called challenge-oriented innovation policies or mission-oriented innovation policies that have been tested for a number of years, first in Sweden, but now in many other places, including in the context of S3, such as in Catalonia. There are very important lessons there about citizen engagement, and it changes a lot the dynamic. Jobs are created, but also and academics also are brought to bear, have an important role in this discussion, but also citizens and place-based solutions are become elevated in importance. So I think that's a potential way to address this shortcoming, to focus on challenges that are not just economic. They have, of course, everything has an economic dimension, but to begin with societal challenges.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Simone Hagenauer about the pilot. Is this pilot already ongoing, finished? Can you give us some more details about that?
The pilot is a commitment by Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner Ferreira after the invitation of the President of the Committee of the Regions, the President of Central Macedonia. So this is something that will be happening after the official launch of this pilot on the 17th, probably of May. And the ones choosing the regions, as I say, and let me be very clear, this is not competing with the RIS3 because it's difficult enough to have the RIS3 as an enabling condition for our colleagues in cohesion to complicate things. No, this is for regions and countries volunteering to test these ideas that Dimitri and colleagues are working on, right? So who is going to choose? The Committee of the Regions with probably DG Regio, and this is going to be their choice. What we are preparing in the JRC, Dimitri and colleagues are preparing criteria. So criteria in order for them to select the best possible volunteering regions. And we wanted to make it balanced, north, south, east, west. But it is up to the Committee of the Regions and probably DG Regio to select the regions. I think there will be, I don't know, Dimitri, when will we be passing on the criteria to them?
we're still discussing with them. I think they expect to launch an expression of interest call within February, but we're very advanced in our discussions. They will be the ones that announce the pilot and making these choices.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Esteban. Esteban, do you want to say a few things very quickly?
Okay, the origins were to align all the stakeholders in a territory in the smart specialization strategies. And still, in this second generation, I feel that still there is room to align public and private investments. So I feel, and I, for example, I have followed the smart specialization strategy in Andalusia, and they have done a really good exercise to make all the publics align. But I feel that still, even if we are speaking about things that are more advanced and needed, the civil society, but still we need to involve the private society. And I like, when you were talking, I was thinking that all the time, and I like very much the backwards approach from Dimitrios. I wonder if this could be a revision of the entrepreneurial discovery process, make it more participatory, because the common vision is better than. I would like to have your impressions of you both. Thank you.
Esteban, Dimitri is going to respond to you, but just two quick things. One is, usually in the entrepreneurial discovery process, the public sector is there to tell and is a one-off. Instead of being there to listen, align, and understand their enlightened self-interest that the private sector carries with them, and to choose and open it up not to the usual suspect of the strongest lobbies in the region. And this is a skill, and not everywhere has happened. Referring to Andalusia, we have with us in the list of attendants Carmen Sillero, who is with us. And Carmen is here now working the ERC for good reason, because between Carmen and Dimitri, there will be this balance between the best science and the most pragmatic approach from someone that comes from dirtying her hands in the reality, the complex, imperfect reality that we will be facing, you will be facing in every region. But Dimitri, please.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think we are inspired by the fact that many of the solutions exist out there in the wild. We haven't invented them. And in fact, some of them have emerged in the context of smart specialization strategies. In Catalonia, as someone mentioned in the chat, this idea of shared agendas, which are territorial plans for transformation, where stakeholders contribute themselves actions to a common goal, and where public money is not the key element. Public money is not the key element. The key element is the focus on common goals. And the wonderful thing about shared agendas is that it allows for coordination, because people open up their plans, and they know how others are going to act, and it builds trust. Of course, the conditions that allow this to happen in Catalonia do not exist everywhere. And we need to have solutions there that are open to everyone. There are many other regions that are doing similar things and can inspire us. And this is what we're hoping to learn through the pilot.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm aware there are 4 or 5 more questions, but I would like to move on, and we will have enough time after the 2 speeches and the 2 interventions to come back to the questions. So I will give the floor to Professor Bakan and introduce him. He's a professor of urban and regional economics at the University of Sheffield Management School. He has been a special advisor to 2 European commissioners, Commissioner Hahn and Commissioner Cretu, in the past, and a consultant to the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission. And the floor is yours, Professor Bakan.
Thank you, Nikos. I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Okay, great. Well, from my perspective also, firstly, just to say Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to come and speak here alongside Mikhail and Dimitris. It's a great honor. I've done quite a few things over the years with URADA and various colleagues, including Nikos yourself. So it's a pleasure to be here. I thought what I will do is give you a bit of a flavor of the background to how a lot of these discussions started. So Mikhail and Dimitris have been explaining in much more detail and structure about the direction of travel and how we're likely to be moving in those directions. And indeed, also the timing of this discussion today is very, very good. Only in the last 2 days, we've had big meetings, Mikhail and the broader team at the Joint Research Center and the wider group advising on the movement from S3 to S4. Plus our meetings have serious discussions just in the last couple of days. So the timing is really pertinent. It's very, very good. But the background, or part of the background to this movement, I was involved at the early stages, working alongside Luc Sauté, that many of you will know from Maastricht and from Brussels. Luc is one of Europe's leading thinkers in the innovation field, as you know, science policy and so on. And Luc and I were brought together under the guidance of Johan Stirner, also in Sevilla at the Joint Research Center, under the leadership of Mikhail and his team, to rethink some elements of these innovation and development policy agendas in the context of the climate change mitigation challenge. So that's the kind of background where I came into these particular discussions. And this is work that's been ongoing alongside Luc and Johan for really nearly 4 years now. So for a good year and a half before the onset of the coronavirus crisis in Europe. So it's not very recent. It's a lot of thinking over a long period. And now, hopefully, as we're slowly starting to emerge from the pandemic, then I think hopefully this is time now in earnest where we can start to move forward more quickly along the lines exactly as Mikhail and Dimitris have been explaining. So just let me give you a flavor. This is what I wanted to do, give you a flavor of the background to this. So of course, we're well aware and familiar with the Smart Specialization, the RIS3 or S3 agenda, as we like to call it. And obviously the key themes in there, S3 is a kind of a storybook of how to think about development and economic development promotion, underpinned by the entrepreneurship and innovation dimensions in a local context. But of course, every context is different. Every region, every city has its own specifics. And to try and build up a way of framing policy design to promote entrepreneurship and innovation, which is sensitive to and appropriate to the context. And some of the key issues we know around policy prioritization, driven principles of diversification around core competences, areas of skill, and scale and embeddedness. So any new developments in terms of skills innovation start to really take root in the locality. And at the same time, also to make sure that those places are engaging with national and international developments to enhance linkages, both locally within the locality, within the region, but also to external sources of knowledge in other parts of the world, whether it's other regions in the same country or other cities and regions elsewhere. And relatedness is one of the principles that we use to think about this, both in terms of academics and also in terms of data gathering. We did have periods in the past in many countries in Europe that we are all well familiar with and remember well, when there was a tendency to parachute in, a high technology electronics company from Taiwan or somewhere without any real thinking about how is that going to bed in to the local economy? How does that dovetail or connect with the local skills profiles? Whereas now the thinking is very different, much more about what are the assets that we're trying to develop and how do we widen them and make them more concrete, that they crystallize much better in terms of the fabric of the local economy. Now, when we think about growth, let's say smart growth, innovation-led growth, vis-a-vis sustainable or inclusive growth, so the Europe 2020 agenda, that throws up a real challenge when we also start to think about the Green Deal and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and trying to achieve a redirection of travel of our economies and societies much more towards climate change mitigation. The issue is here is to what extent it shifts priorities, and how do those shifts in priorities translate in terms of how we think or rethink our approaches to economic development. So really the challenge is, what do we think about a smart specialization type of way of thinking, but now also taking on board very seriously the Green Deal types of challenges. So the report that Luc Sauté and myself put together, published in early 2020, is called Place-Based Innovation for Sustainability, and it's available on the website of the Joint Research Centre in Seville. So that's the kind of background, what we were thinking about. Now what are the kind of principles that when you start thinking these terms, challenging the notion of kind of economic development, innovation and entrepreneurship-led development in the climate change context, then some of the focus and the ways that we frame issues start to shift somewhat. So if we go back to, again, the Europe 2020 agenda, smart, sustainable, inclusive, one of the difficulties that started to emerge from those of us working in the field, evaluating different regions, looking at policy programs and so on. Of course, EURADA, you have a huge footprint in this area anyway, enormous footprint, is that sometimes smart, sustainable, inclusive are not aligned with each other, or maybe two dimensions are aligned, but the third one is misaligned, or none of them are aligned with each other. And that poses real challenges. And the response to the lack of alignment in some contexts was that policymakers and politicians would tend to view these things as a kind of a menu, a drop-down menu. Okay, we're going to choose smart. If those guys want to do inclusive, that's fine with us. Or those regions want to do sustainable, we're going to do the smart stuff. That's going to be our choice. And the difficulty here was that there tended to be more people saying, we're going to do the smart, and other people can kind of do the sustainable or the inclusive. Now, the reason for that is the inclusive and the sustainable are often, in a sense, harder to do because they're slow burning. They're over much longer time periods. And they also involve lots of other dimensions that sometimes the smart doesn't. So the smart tends to be more focused on technology, science, R&D, that kind of way of thinking. And in some sense, we're better prepared along those lines. We've got more experience, more of a trajectory of working in that manner. And so for some reasons, it was really relatively easy to say, okay, we're going to do the R&D led stuff. We're going to do the smart, and the sustainable or the inclusive is kind of treated sometimes as a little bit of an afterthought, or maybe that's too hard for us to do that at the moment. Whereas the Green Deal changes the ordering of priority. The Green Deal says that inclusive and sustainable become absolutely paramount. If things are not sustainable and inclusive, in the long run, they're not smart because they won't be viable. They won't continue. And so this throws down a very fundamental conceptual as well as practical challenge to the ways that we think about innovation-led development. And so the argument that we put forward, Luc and myself, is that actually you need to shift to much more directionality, where growth should be smart for sustainable and inclusive, smart for sustainable and smart for inclusive. The point is that any knowledge-related, entrepreneurship and innovation-related underpinnings of economic development strategies, the core elements, should be in the service of sustainable and inclusive development. So that's the notion of for FOR, in the sense of being in the service of. And then you start to impose directionality to economic development policy thinking. And, you know, we have debates a lot out there at the moment around things like mission-oriented policies, the kind of Mazzucato type of approach. Well, in a sense, this is kind of consistent with that way of thinking, saying actually we are acknowledging now explicitly there is an ordering of priorities. If we don't get the sustainable and inclusive things right, everything else is not going to work out. As exactly as Paul Krugman's been arguing very, very explicitly for a long time. This is not a marginal additional option to address. This is the fundamental game in town. If we don't get this right, nothing else is going to work out correctly. So it's really imposing directionality on these things. And that's also important because if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, you know, sometimes I read them and I think they kind of read a little bit like they've been written by a committee. You know, there's lots of stuff added on. The problem is that these things imply trade-offs. And one of the core elements of smart specialization thinking, going back more than 15 years, and of course, Mikel, Xavier Gonag, Mikel and Abasso and so on, were involved in this right at the outset, more than 15 years ago, is that it's tackling trade-offs is the real issue that needs to be addressed always. And those trade-offs and complementarities are different in different regions and different localities. So we know that these trade-offs and complementarity possibilities are different according to place, but to think about those trade-offs and complementarities in the context of what takes place in the region, in the context of the institutional framework, but explicitly that the sustainability and inclusiveness issues, any smart innovation related or entrepreneurship related action or intervention has to be in the service of enhancing sustainability and inclusiveness. So that's basically conceptually the reordering which is required. Now, part of that also now involves the need to build some sort of unifying narrative. And the difficulty here is, as we know from European data in the United States, also in the UK, many other countries, that weaker regions, economically weaker regions, are often more vulnerable to climate change, you know, water shortages, for example, you know, greater degradation regarding agricultural land, these kind of issues. But interestingly and importantly, they are also often more vulnerable to climate change mitigation strategies. And that's something which is often never addressed. The kind of Green Deal types of issues in many countries, not just in parts of Europe, but also that kind of thinking in other parts of the world, including North America, the UK, elsewhere, often comes with a very optimistic spin on it, that moving to new green type of jobs is going to enhance dramatically weaker parts of the country. It's a very good news story. But actually, when you look at the evidence and the data normally says a very different story. That often these places are very vulnerable to the strategies themselves. And the reason is because they tend to be more carbon intensive and more carbon extensive in terms of their production systems. So they tend to have a greater presence. Economically weaker regions often have a greater presence in sectors which are very carbon intensive in terms of their activities. And they're also carbon extensive in the sense that those carbon intensive activities are right the way through the input-output supply chains in those regions. So in order to move to a much greener type of way of doing business, we need to restructure much more of the economic fabric locally and reorient a lot more of the technologies and activities and organizational relationships in those places in comparison to more prosperous regions, which already tend to be further down the road in that direction, with a lot of technologies which can really respond to the climate change mitigation opportunities. So there's a lot of commercial incentives, and also many of the more prosperous regions are less exposed to the climate change mitigation shocks. So the difficulty here is the ability to make the kind of transitions that we need. It depends on the existing fabric of industries, the skills profile, the local infrastructure context, and the local economic structure. And it's not always that moving to a more green and inclusive approach necessarily favors the weaker regions. A lot of evidence says in many cases it goes in the opposite direction. So the difficulty there is, in terms of our European-wide approaches to regional development, we don't want to impose policies which are going to make it worse for the weaker regions, whereas more prosperous regions become even more prosperous. So we have to think of a way of squaring that circle. And it's also important because if we can't square those circles, then you'll get fundamental political opposition to the climate change mitigation agenda anyway. And you need to have those institutional and societal responses all aligned correctly in order to make the kind of progress that we absolutely need to make. So where does the S3 tradition contribute to the S4 agenda? Well, of course, the S3 tradition was so heavily about developing on-the-ground narratives, increasing local ownership of the policy agenda. The advantages of local decision-making are building on local knowledge and local reconnaissance, exactly what S3 has been pushing for over the last decade or so. So we've already got that culture of building local knowledge. Well, that needs to be exploited even further and leveraged, but in this new climate change mitigation context. Of course, there are huge challenges that all of our regions are facing. Demographic challenges are very severe in many parts of Europe. The new technologies, automation, AI, Mikhail's already referred to those. They're going to impose challenges across different income groups, different skills groups. We've got the broader well-being agenda about quality of life. We also see that the job polarization shocks. It's the middle income, middle class, middle skills groups who've been losing out, exactly as Mikhail presented in the diagram very recently. And there's the broader geography of discontent. This kind of anti-establishment political shocks tend to be much stronger in weaker places. So this is the kind of context. These are the headwinds blowing against us that we're having to face up to in terms of the movements we want to make. But still, the RIS3 agenda provides enormous infrastructure intellectually in terms of behavior and so on which to build to move to the S4 agenda. So the key thing is obviously we need to search for complementarities where you're trying to build linkages between sustainability and inclusiveness and smart. It cannot be a menu. It has to be about building those links. The kind of things that may involve in some cases may be some sort of institutional differentiation, changes to jurisdictions, decision-making authority, because you've got to obviously limit the power of any incumbents. Because you want to develop these new pilots, the trialing of the kind of things that Dimitris was already talking about. But importantly, the search for these complementarities and to overcome trade-offs can be better observed locally and acted on. Of course it can. And why is that important? Because the real chance of responding to climate change and really making genuine progress on mitigation strategies is making numerous small steps on many, many fronts at the same time. It cannot be primarily about big ticket investments. That will never work. It has to be about thousands and thousands of small steps simultaneously in many, many different types of places, so that local people identify the opportunities for experimentation and innovation with a strong sustainability focus in which any R&D or knowledge-led actions are in the service of promoting sustainability and inclusiveness. And as more and more societies and communities come together to make those steps forward, you start to shift the dial very, very slowly. But of course, demonstration effects really matter. When one place starts to see that in other places, they're doing it and they're starting to see progress, however small, that starts to become cumulative. So that decentralized, localized engagement is critical. And of course, the RIS3 agenda was all about driving exactly those kinds of changes so that all types of places can start to become involved. In the case of the sustainability agenda, I think this is even more critical than we've talked about before. And the reason is that a lot of the focus over the last 10 or 15 years, this is worldwide, this is not an EU phenomenon, on sustainability innovations has tended to focus heavily on the very prosperous cities. And the reason is that the technology companies producing new technologies for remote sensing, smart metering, heat management, road traffic and transportation management, they have a cultural and particularly a commercial incentive to align themselves with prosperous places. That's part of their marketing strategies. So what tends to happen is these new technologies are trialed and rolled out in, let's call, political petri dishes. That's how the Economist describes these kind of actions. But they're nearly always in the places which are already very prosperous. And of course, that goes against what needs to happen where everybody needs to be involved. So we need to think about how do you shift that away from the usual suspects, the big cities, and particularly the big and prosperous cities, always being in the vanguard, in the lead of these innovations. It has to be involved also in terms of the weaker places. Otherwise, the corporate and science advocates will always favor the bigger places because it's in their interest to do so. And that's something that also we need to avoid. So weaker places tend to be more carbon extensive and carbon intensive. More prosperous cities tend to be in the forefront of a lot of these new technologies, and the corporate sector will tend to support that alignment, but we need to find ways to move that out to the weaker places, the weaker parts of Europe, weaker regions, which are also more exposed. And that's extremely important in terms of this wider context of getting people engaged on multiple fronts, multiple actions in a very decentralized manner. So we're thinking of, you have to think about peri-urban areas, rural contexts, small isolated towns, or areas which have faced heavy deindustrialization over the last 2 or 3 decades. So we need to think about specifically what are the challenges in these kind of situations where we can develop appropriate policies which link with the local institutional and governance capabilities. We need to think about, if you like, smart financial solutions which are specifically designed for weaker places. And these kind of innovations focused on sustainability and inclusion are going to things that require very low discount rates and very long time periods in terms of repayments. So we need very, very, in a sense, non-market solutions, not standard short-term interventions, but these need to be very long-term, very patient capital types of interventions wherever necessary. This is central to the Green Deal agenda. And my final points here are that the Joint Research Centre in Seville has already provided the institutional infrastructure to help support exactly these transitions. The platform, the RIS3 platform, is ideally placed and situated to provide exactly the kinds of technical support and reconnaissance that local areas need in order to undertake these kinds of activities. I think there's other complementary evidence which has been provided but can be provided further around things like social surveys and attitudinal surveys. I think this is very important because a lot of these things are about how people perceive the future in the medium term and the long term. We need much more information on that, but also to heighten awareness of how important these things are. The monitoring of approaches, experiences, and outcomes, people's narratives, what they see locally versus the wider European agenda. Again, the RIS3 platform, let's call it the RIS4 platform, but the team in Seville are ideally positioned for these kinds of activities. So I think I'll probably stop there, Nikos, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a very interesting, excellent presentation, and talking about vulnerabilities, about all the dangers that we're facing, about the weaker cities and regions and so on. I think this is interesting for everybody. I would like to move on. I'm aware of the time. We're running a little bit late, so we're going to leave the questions and discussions for later. So put your questions in the chat while I give the floor to one of our 2 distinguished panelists that they have the honor to have with us today. So first is Ingeborg Meyer. Ingeborg is a researcher at Leiden University and leader of the working group Society Using Research at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at the university. She has been involved in the MORI project, now in the Super MORI project, and also the New Horizon project. A lot of experience on responsible research innovation. Ingeborg.
Thank you very much, Nikos, for your introduction, and thanks a lot to the speakers for their interesting and overviewing story of smart specialization. as Nico said, my background comes from the responsible research and innovation side in the Supermori project, A New Horizon, which is about grounding RI principles, but more recently also in two respective territorial RI projects, which combine the smart specialization ideas in the regions with the RI concepts, trying to reconcile that with each other, one in the healthcare sector and one in the energy transition sector. So it's about cherries and repeat, and I have seen that some of my colleagues are there too in the audience. But not only in those two, because from Supermori we have developed a ecosystem of related science with and for society projects that are also working in the territorial RI realm. And so together we are now having this, what we call territorial SWAFS ecosystem, where we meet very regularly to discuss all these issues. And my feedback to your stories comes from a more practical and reality type of input based upon our experiences in these regional projects where we work together so closely with the quadruple helix stakeholders, industry, citizens, policy, academics, and the lessons we have learned from that. I think the first lesson is that there is such a big diversity that there is no one size fits all. I think that also one of the things that we have learned from our particular project is that the smart specialization strategy is very much located within the economic domain. It's economically driven, and it is hardly ever based on the let's say knowledge base that allows for diversity and innovative related knowledges and technologies that can drive economic strengthening in these regions. It's so our experience is that bringing together these stakeholders is a totally different exercise than working from these policy documents. And in that sense, the logic framework that you put down in writing, and which is completely recognizable from all my evaluation experiences that I've done, is not necessarily in sync with the messiness of these innovation projects that you often see happening. And that makes it much more difficult to assess the outcomes of those processes. And then I'm not even talking about how to include the responsible research and innovation principles of responsiveness, inclusiveness, and anticipation and reflection to these local situations. And so what we have developed within this group of territorial projects is this idea of R3 for S4. And that is something where we integrate, let's say, the more qualitative and reflexive considerations with the smart specialization strategies of those regions. And as soon as you do that, then of course you immediately enter into a governance issue, because the question is who have the agency and the ownership of having these type of conversations, using all the available knowledge that you can have to make and to choose priorities. And I sometimes feel that this European Green Deal presents the same type of problem as the responsible research or RI policy has put on these regions, because we have noticed that it takes a while for them to translate those concepts into things that make sense to them, and that is more or less it is sort of easily digested by policymakers. It's a bit more difficult for the business sector, but especially for the civil society and the citizens, these concepts are really distant and far away. So it takes time to translate the concepts into the regions and for the regional stakeholders. And I think that is to really go into this local level and have these conversations should accompany any process based upon more quantitative data, because otherwise I think this transformative change and the Green Deal will in order to avoid that they become paper tigers, we need to have those shared agendas as the CERI project mentions and calls them in the local situation. So I think that is, but it's for us very good to see that these pilots from the JRC will take place and will be developed, and we are interested to see how we can feed our R3/4S4 ideas into these pilots. So we are very happy to discuss this further. So I think also to leave some time for the others, I think I leave my comments to this. So that's it from the RI perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingeborg. Thank you. Very, very valid points. I take the governance issue and the ownership that are extremely important. I think also Michael and Dimitris, Michael especially said about the quality of governance and how this affects the innovation as well as other things. So that's this is really very, very important. Let me move to the second invited panelist, which is Nguyen Nguyen, Associate Professor at the NTNU, Faculty of Economics and Management, Department of Industrial Economics and Technology Management. She is also a Senior Researcher at Nordland Research Institute in Bodo, Norway, and Associate Editor of the Learning Organization Journal. And of course, she is the coordinator of the CERI project, a sister project of TeRRItoria that worked a lot in this issue. So, Nguyen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nikos, for your kind introduction. And thank you, TeRRItoria Project, for inviting me here to share my ideas. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to join you in a discussion of this important and exciting topic. How will regional strategies look like in the near future and after 2027? And what is the next generation of smart specialization strategy? So these topics have been presented very thorough with in-depth analysis from the guest speaker, Dr. Mikhail Lanabaso and Dr. Dimitris Bontikakis and Professor Philip Macken, and also the reflection from my colleagues Ingeborg, which give me a lot of good food for thought. So based on that, my intervention will focus on the topic for the way forward, how we could design more effective multi-level governance policy. And I hope it can contribute some local narratives to illustrate the process, because everyone, like in the comments, I see that it sounds like an academic project with so many ideas and complexity. And how can we actually put it into real life to inspire region to do it? So that's what my intervention is about. And so when hearing the terms S4 for the first time, some of us might wonder, so isn't it just adding the element of sustainability for S3? That means we can continue using S3, but in the state of prioritizing, we put sustainability in. So it's just a new bottle for an old wine, or just updated label for the same product, or not? The more I learn about S4 and listen to the presentation today, the more I understand that S4 does not just mean adding sustainability to S3. It means more than that. It requires changing of the way we think, the way we work together for sustainability. And in other words, it needs a transformative institutional changes for better governance. So the question would be, what are all the elements could be added to S3 to make it become S4? I believe there are many things. but I want to share my thoughts on about an important element which can be integrated in S3 process that could transform it into S4, and it is RI, the responsible research and innovation. So my intervention, again, example is based on the real life experience, would take place at the Catalonian region, Lower Austria, and Nordland region in the Horizon 2020 project called CRI, which aims at integrating RI principle into the S3 process, which I'm fortunate to be the project coordinator. Before discussing in depth the role of RI in this transformation process, let me describe briefly the sustainability challenge this region wants to address during the RIS3 process, or S3 process. So the first region example is Catalonian, which want to respond to their most pressing needs, zero waste. They want to take the pilot action started first in B30. And B30 is a main industry hub for innovation, research, and entrepreneurship in Catalonia, which is making a transition to a circular economy. Their specific challenge is to find the governance model that encourages regional stakeholders to work together to develop and implement solutions to achieve waste-free economic development in B30. Another example is Lower Austria. In Lower Austria, the plastic industry has been contributing significantly, not only to the GDP, but also to the quality of our lives when it comes to medical technology, healthcare, construction, mobility, and infrastructure, etc. However, plastic industry, as you all know, is struggling with a negative public image. And therefore, they have to face a challenge that how can the plastic industry be aware of their responsibility and take action to contribute to environment-friendly, resource-conserving, CO2 neutral economy. And by the way, my partner in Lower Austria also here in the audience, Simone. And the final example is Nordland, a region from northern Norway. Nordland is a home to just 4.5% of Norway population, but contains 25% of coastline of Norway. So marine industry are therefore of vital importance in regional economic development. Therefore, responsible coastal management has been defined as a core challenge in Nordland. How might the regional county council be able to manage the conflicted interest in coastal development so that they can strike a balance between creating incentive for industry and then protecting the environment? So those are the sustainability challenge that the project approach tried to use or integrate in the principle of RRI in the process of RIS3 with the hope that this approach can solve the sustainability challenge. And by integrating RRI principle, I refer to anticipation, inclusion, responsiveness, and reflexivity. So it took us around 3 years to experiment what would be a reasonable and logical process to integrate RI into S3 for sustainability. Our findings show that this integrating process consists 3 stages. First, a core challenge for the region is defined, and this should be done together with the quadruple helix actors. And second, foresight methodology is used to map out possible future scenario for the region. And then a regional strategy is created on the basis of insight come from scenario foresight. And this stage, again, must be done together with regional key stakeholders. And third, the regional government implement a strategy in cooperation with relevant stakeholders. And I think it might be easier if I share with you the figure that summarizes the process so that you know what I see and how RI can actually be integrated in this process. So I'm sharing my screen here, and please let me know if you see it. Okay, great. So this is the 3-stage process I mentioned about, and you can see the keyword in this process is the word co. So in the first stage, when the regional challenge is co-defined and co-formulated, then all participants can see the same problem and own the problem. And that's important, that the ownership of the problem, that they feel compelling to solve it. So by agreeing to the same formulation of the challenge, co-developed regional strategy becomes straightforward, since now all participants are evaluating solution approach based on the same criteria and understanding. And the commitment from this process leads to the co-implementation and success in the last stage. So this process can repeat it as necessary to respond to the changing regional condition. And the 4 RI principles are integrated in this process in details. For example, Responsiveness means that the process is designed to respond to societal values and changing circumstance, taking into consideration the urgent needs or challenge of the region. And it's important to have a compelling mission that can bring people together. As I mentioned, the challenge of each region before: zero waste, CO2 neutral economy, or responsible coastal management. And the second RI principle, inclusive, means that all types of actors are included in all stages of discussion. And to do so, we need to understand the role of each group of actors in building an ecosystem. And during the co-creation process, those roles become very prominent. And the third principle, anticipation, means that the topic of discussion consider outcome beyond the regional competitiveness, especially in regards to environmental and social issues. And we found that strategic foresight with scenario planning is really important, because in this process, together with stakeholders, we learn together. Everyone open to different mindset and perspective, to see different possibility, and then to uncover the important opportunities, risks, and trade-off, like mentioned in the keynote speak before. What's the trade-off faced by the region? And participants are encouraged to think out the box, and that's how the mutual learning happens. But also what important is unlearning, which is the mechanism to bridge the single loop learning to double loop learning, and to help the creation of the shared agenda, which I will present later. And the last dimension is reflexivity, which means the discussion also moves beyond the intended outcome to consider possible unintended effect of the process. And this image illustrates how the project acts as a shared space in which the knowledge conversion and creation has taken place. And this is how the city transnational learning process taken place too, starting with different territorial perspective. And after that, the synthesis process is a CRI model, which I presented before. So based on that, we share learning. And in this transnational learning, we also have all the network of affiliated territories, where I see my colleagues, Jekke Jonsson from the NAT members also presented also here in the audience. And the result from this process, as one mentioned before, the shared agenda. So in B30, the ambition of all actors working together to develop the implementing innovative solution has been achieved after the project ended. So a shared agenda for B30 addressed the transition towards circular economy was materialized, and the framework, mechanism, methodology in the project, the CRI project, has been integrated into the strategy of RISC-3, or maybe RISC-4 now. And based on that new project, also be funded, and other initiatives have been leveraged and synchronized during the last stage. And similar positive results have been achieved with the other region in the CRI project. For example, in Lower Austria, one of the most important outcomes is the establishment of the association OCC2, Austrian Carbon Cycle Circle, which aims to promote a responsible mindset and holistic thinking in plastic industry. And last but not least, in Nordland, the RI approach has helped them in the process of developing a responsible coastal management strategy, but successfully engaged stakeholders in an early stage of the process. And of course, I would stop here. I would not say so much about the detail. And if you want to find more, you can see in the website. So I just want to summarize that how RI principle actually can help the regional innovation policy, or S3, to achieve the objective that Dimitri actually pointed out in his slide. Because this RI process of integrating RI into S3 can deliver effective solution to pressing societal challenge through co-creation process. And it illustrates how multi-level governance looks like, and how to bridge the bottom-up approach. And that's why I believe the RI approach can help region to design a more effective multi-level governance policy for S4 process. And I think the key that make it happen is the RI facilitator, or the change. And with this, I want to close my intervention and look forward to hearing your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nian, for this very nice presentation and emphasis on inclusiveness and participation. That I think complements a lot of the discussions that we had before, and emphasizing the role of RRI into building a more inclusive smart specialization strategy. I would like now, we have some time for discussion. There were some questions in the chat from previously. I would like to give the floor to the people who have done the questions to express them. There are not so many. So I will go to Stefano Bonfa first. If he's still here and listens, he can take the mic and do. Or Stefano Bonfa, I'm not sure if he's.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Go on.
Yes. Okay, I'm just want to ask you concerning this, Smart Specialization version 4, S4. I was thinking it's more related with data-driven approach in developing a strategy for the region, because all the world is moving, industry is moving towards, let's say, industrial point 4, or anything related in environmental side is moving towards 4. So why, let's say, S3 is still remain S3, changing different type of approach and not moving towards, let's say, data-driven concept. And also, this means that you have to focus mainly on data and the new technology, like artificial intelligence, big data. They can support the regional development strategy in order to have, let's say, new innovation. You have to discover something new. Now the technology is here, platform is here, the data are there. So it's question of, let's say, implementing the things. We are doing, for example, a pilot project in several environments. One of this is in Calabria, for example. And then we are approaching the concept of data-driven AI-based model for developing strategy. Before you start to build the infrastructure, before you start to invest in a long term. And then the other question is, you have to monitoring. You have to evaluate in a long way. How you do this if you don't have such tool like this one? And this is the question that I'm asking. Thank you.
Our colleagues from JRC, maybe Dimitris or Michael. Yes.
Yeah, I can. It's a very good question. It's a very good question, and in fact, it's an important part of our reflections. There are two parts to this answer. One is that the digital transition is very important. It's part of the Green Deal, and it's part of the directionality that we're talking about. So this is very much at the heart of what we are doing with S4, what we're trying to do. The second part to the answer is that, and this is a great idea, that data needs to underpin, and evidence needs to underpin strategies. In fact, we are thinking how important monitoring is and evaluation to these strategies. And whether we had exactly the same thinking, whether you can begin, in fact, with the monitoring in part of your strategy. Whether you can build around open data and whether you can continue to build a data-driven system. Now, there are many opportunities there because of technological advancement and because of the greater data, the use of APIs, greater use of open data. But there are also important limitations. I don't know where this noise is coming from. There are greater limitations. There are great limitations still insofar as many of the disadvantaged groups and communities that will be at the heart of S4 may not be fully reflected. So it cannot be entirely based data or designed around the data system. And these are important reflections that we are taking very seriously now. And we need your advice, we need your inputs, we need inspiration from your own projects. And I would very much like more about the project that Mr. Bonfa referred to, in case you can learn from it. Thank you for mentioning.
Thank you, Dimitris. I would like to give the floor to Dimitris Fourpakis now. You hear me, Dimitris? Yes.
Thank you, Nico, and thanks to everybody, to Phil and to Michael and Dimitris for excellent presentations today. As I put in the chat, I think that this is an extremely interesting idea, and the way the project is being put into place is very, very interesting. But from the academic point of view, it's an extremely interesting project. However, I have the impression that it's going to be very, very complex. And I don't need to remind Mikel that complexity was always in what we had been undertaking in the past. And the results at the end was not always what we were expecting. At the moment, on the other hand, everybody knows that member states are now going to implement at full speed the plans that they have submitted from the Resilience and Recovery Facility. And as everybody knows, there is very little talk about regional dimension or even smart specialization in this. There was also a sense of emergency, and we can understand all that. So when this project will be probably advanced, maybe 2 years from now, in the most optimistic I would say view, it will be very, very difficult to see how then we will be able to operationalize any dimension of this. I repeat it, in terms of academic terms, it's an extremely interesting project. But I fear that we are missing a very important operational dimension that because we miss it, it will be automatically filled by other, more, I would say, opportunistic, players in the area. And as we have seen in 1 or 2 slides, there is no shortage of such opportunistic interventions. Thank you very much.
Very good. If I may, yeah, Nikos, Dimitri, thank you. I think these are very good points and very difficult to respond. I think, well, first, our secret agenda is to count on visibility and contamination, because we fully agree with you, and I said it in my intervention, how is it possible, and time and rushing is not the excuse, that in the national plans, there is not a lot more good ideas stemming from the good work of the RIS3 where it has worked well, and there are several places in which it has happened. And why is this? So visibility and contamination means that even though the pilot will be up and running or launched in May probably, the visibility of RIS or S4, RIS3, the process that we are defending for so long altogether, will probably contaminate the thinking of the decision makers that for the moment are, let's say, money is chasing ideas, and instead of the other way around, right? So one of the objectives that we have with this is that to make decision makers with the funding capacity aware of the good partnerships, public-private, or even bigger, that come with ideas that fit strategic objectives that are concentrated and are deeply rooted in the different territories, not a one-size-fits-all that Ingeborg was referring to, because she's exactly right on that one. So we think that we still have the time to contaminate and increase visibility of the S4, and therefore change the way the money is used for the recovery funds and coordinate them better with the efforts made by cohesion policy. This is one of the objectives. And the skill here, Dimitri, as you rightly put it, is to distill from the good theory, the pragmatic, the practical ways forward in the different territories that we aim to achieve through this playbook, modular playbook that Dimitri was referring to.
Thank you, Miguel. I would like to give the floor to Fabio Feudo.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikos. I wrote the question after the the intervention of the Lando Basso and Pontikakis from the Joint Research Center. But what I wrote it was partially also underlined by the intervention of Ingeborg and Nian. So my question was exactly that of how Joint Research Center in its work in reforming S3 towards S4 intend to have more detail. I would like to have more detail, if it's possible, on how Joint Research Center intend to take information to use also the knowledge and the practices produced in the last 10 years, but particularly in the Horizon 2020 program related to this responsible research and innovation activities carried out at territorial level, which is very important for their work, and also to coordinate all the efforts that have been done in the last year in order to have a more productive use of knowledge in the production of the territorial the policy for the territorial dimension. So this was a question, but also a wish in a certain sense.
Okay, well, I think what Ingeborg was saying is something that makes total sense to me. She was saying three things I noted down. Is the one-size-fits-all doesn't work. This is a premise we have maintained on which we have built the RIS3 methodology. That local conversations have to complement, amplify, and build upon hard data, which is one of the issues that Dimitri was raising in terms of open entrepreneurial discovery process. And then she also referred to going beyond a narrow economic perspective when designing the missions. And I think this is totally within the spirit of what we intend to do for the reasons we try to explain with this S4. And then when Nin is referring to Niederösterreich or Catalonia, you know, to respond to your question in practice, sharing these good practices, in particular, what she has shown us at these 3 stages to incorporate RRI, from the conception to the implementation, they could be very closely related to the methodology that we are going to propose. And let me tell you that, you know, we have drawn from the evaluation of Horizon on this one, the Smart Spec, which is the biggest, I think, effort that I know on evaluating RIS3 in 2016 by the University of Cardiff and other colleagues, is something that has figured prominently in our thinking for S4. Plus, you know, the experience of Niederösterreich, Simone is there around. Niederösterreich is a region that has been experimenting with RIS for more than 20 years now. And she's been one of the best in the class. And we certainly will give, you know, through the JRC Seville and our platform, as Dimitri was mentioning, the opportunity to, you know, showcase good practice and provide platforms for people to exchange, peer review, and, you know, understand better these, for example, the incorporation of these notions of RRI into the new playbook. Dimitri, please, if you want to complement.
Yeah, no, this is quite right. I think I could summarize it as saying that in the JSC we have very keen ears, and we are very attentive watchers of what's happening in the territories, and we try and work with the territories to learn from them. The platform itself has engaged very meaningfully in extensive peer reviews. There's a lot of experience in the platform that allows us to extract this knowledge from the ground and reflect it in our work. We have also co-created past methodologies with practitioners. I will mention here only the methodology I was involved on territorial reviews of industrial transition, the point methodology, projecting opportunities for industrial transitions that was co-developed with practitioners from Catalonia and others in a working group, a link to which I will leave in the chat. And during S4, we foresee working very closely with practitioners as part of the pilot. And this is really what the pilot is about, to learn and to co-create with practitioners, find these solutions, and come up with ways to enable pervasive experimentation, as Philip mentioned earlier on, that we need thousands of these experiments to take place before we begin to raise the dial, so that these transitions are accelerated. And this is already happening. We're confident that it can be done because we see it being done in the examples that Nian mentioned too, as well as many other examples across Europe.
Thank you.
Sorry, thanks. Thank you. We still have a few more minutes. I would like to give the floor to Just Quisper, if I pronounce it correctly. He's still around with us, wants to talk. Yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joost Kuiper, working at the province of Overijssel in the east of the Netherlands. My question is about engaging the citizens. The citizen science, it's always used easily, but it's a very difficult group to attract to responsible innovation. From my own point of experience, we as a civil servant, I'm used to work with the democratic elected representatives at municipal level or regional level. But what we have seen in the last 5 to 10 years is that those groups, the municipalities, have retracted their also their financial contribution to projects in the field of innovation, with companies pushing forward because they can deliver and they also keep ownership for what they do. So my question is about how to organize or strengthen the cooperative ownership of groups of citizens in the next S4 project. Are we going to change something also in the rules of engagement in the operational programs itself? And the question is for anybody who can answer, but maybe GLC.
Okay, yeah. Just, this is beyond cohesion policy. Let me share with you one image for me, which is close to my heart. I don't know if you can see the image. Are you seeing any image?
Yes,
here?
the EPRIS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the least developed region in Europe, the poorest at the time. And this is a bar. And this is our friend Dimitris Skalkos in front of a computer with the local community. You don't see many women there. This is 2000. This is discussing risk. This is about open entrepreneurial discovery process. This is about talking innovation in Epirus. And Nikos can tell you how difficult this could be. And Dimitri, of course. This is what we have to do. With some champions, with some leaders, many of them should come from Eurada. They should be based on the best thinking that you can gather with Ingeborg, with what we have heard from Nin, with the ideas that more good or bad we are trying to develop to improve the RIS3 methodology. We have to go out there to the bars if it is necessary and convene these people into an interesting conversation, into a consensus about what are the objectives, socioeconomic objectives, social included, within the digital transition and the green transition that we want and can pulled together. This is what there's four biggest challenges, is going into this bar, convince them and engage in a conversation with them. This is 20-something years ago. And it happened because Dimitris Escalco had the courage to do it with some quite good results, by the way. So I just wanted to have a visual image of what it means.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we don't have much time. We promised 2 hours. We don't want to keep you here for 2.5. Everybody is busy. So allow me to thank our keynote speakers, our panelists, and everybody who kept company with us for 1 hour. I would say it was a very fruitful discussion. The main takeaways, if I can summarize, is, first of all, for me, responsible research innovation and smart specialization, we have a common element, this innovation. We need to be innovative in all aspects. We need to have innovation in governance, innovation in monitoring and evaluation, as we said, with data and AI and everything. We have to have innovation in civic participation. I listened with very big interest that the new smart specialization will have an emphasis on directionality. Sorry about that. So that means that we have a directionality which is a top-down approach. So we have to enforce also a bottom-up approach, and civil participation, citizen engagement is very, very important in order to balance this. And there are many RRI projects, TeRRItoria among them, that they have experimented with approaches of participatory engagement of citizens and civil society to the innovation planning process, and can offer valuable insights on emphasizing social buy-in and inclusiveness. And I think JRC and our colleague also, Professor McKinsey, has emphasized that, and we are common ground here. So thank you all for being here. I would like, before we close, to give the floor to Dr. Ildiko Ipoli, the coordinator of TeRRItoria, for a last word, let's say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nikos. After a wonderful meeting like this, what remains to me is to thank all the participants, our invited speakers, first of all, and panelists for their great contribution, those who join to listen, learn, and share. Nikos Zaharis, of course, the moderator of the event today, the RADA team for the organization of the meeting series, and of course, all the TeRRItoria consortium. As Nikos already mentioned at the start of our meeting, this was the last event of the TeRRItoria final event series. The series consisted of 3 events and aimed the systematic presentation of our findings as of the objectives of TeRRItoria in 3 themes. First, how to create more inclusive, open territorial research and innovation systems in terms of actors and engagement. Second, how to introduce concrete and measurable institutional changes in the TeRRItoria partner organizations, territories, and of course beyond, and develop a better understanding of how responsible research and innovation can be adopted at territorial level. And finally, as of today, analyzing the potential of RRI to enhance smart specialization strategies, improve regional strategies, and the way forward. I really hope that we have actually managed to efficiently showcase the work that we have done in these 3 events and share the experiences and, of course, the conclusions that the work has led us to. And I think it's worth to mention that the implementation of TeRRItoria was very much challenged by the recent global sanitary situation. And at the same time, these special times have led us to appreciate even more, I believe, the importance of the 4 dimensions of responsible research and innovation, anticipation, effectiveness, inclusion, and responsiveness. And moreover, the importance of communication itself and the various communication approaches in this context. I believe that in the framework of the TeRRItoria project and with its wider network, we have built a valuable knowledge base, lasting functional networks, and most of all have managed to make valuable and sustainable changes. And I also hope, just to finish the meeting today, that you have found some takeaways participating at our events.
As a last note before saying goodbye, I would like to remind you that the results of TeRRItoria, including the recordings of our final event series as of today as well, will be shared on the project website, the social media channels, and of course, ultimately also on Zenodo. And with this last note, I would like to thank you very much again for being with us today. It has been an honor. And here we close the final event series of TeRRItoria. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ellie.
Bye bye.